Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the Listen Up Girl podcast. I am your host, Zach Randles-Friedman. Today's episode is a little bit heavy, not because it's loud, not because it's dramatic, because it's systematic. This week, we're looking at several different stories about what's happening across courts, classrooms, federal agencies, and even international governments. It's a pattern. It's a pattern of erasure. It's a pattern of exclusion. It's a pattern of rewriting who counts and who doesn't. So let's get into today's news, and let's start with the Supreme Court. Trans athlete bans and the Supreme Court. Laws banning transgender athletes from school sports are often sold as narrow solutions to a limited problem. The pitch usually sounds something like this. It only affects a small number of students, it protects fairness, and it safeguards girls' sports. But that promise has actually never been true. Since 2020, 27 states have passed laws banning transgender youth from participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity. And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, many of those laws allow for invasive forms of sex testing that don't just target transgender students, but they put all female student athletes at risk. Once schools are asked to police who belongs, scrutiny doesn't stop with transgender kids. It extends to any girl who doesn't look feminine enough. Any athlete who performs too well, anybody that doesn't conform to expectation. At their core, these cases are not just about being transgender athletes. They are about who gets to decide what a woman's body is supposed to look like in sports, and what happens to every woman who doesn't fit that expectation. Now that question, who decides eligibility and how, is squarely before the Supreme Court. And whatever decision comes down will ripple far beyond sports, because once the state claims authority to define bodies, that authority rarely stays confined to one arena. Next, we go to Kansas, where Kansas invalidates trans identities. While the legal battle unfolds nationally, the consequences are already personal in Kansas. Transgender residents have begun receiving letters informing them that their driver's license and birth certificates are being invalidated under SB 244, which has now gone into effect. The law also bars them from using restrooms that match their identity and imposes fines up to $1,000. Imagine updating your documents legally, following the process, paying the fees, living your life, and then receiving a letter telling you that your state no longer recognizes you. This isn't symbolic. It affects employment applications, housing paper, travel, voting, every situation that requires an ID. When governments retroactively rewrite identity documents, that's not administrative housekeeping, that's institutional erasure. So not two good stories we're starting off with. Next, LGBTQ plus data disappearing from federal surveys. So let's talk about something quieter, but possibly even more consequential. A new law from the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law reveals that approximately 360 federal data collections have removed at least one sexual orientation or gender identity question since the orange convicted felon returned to office in January. 360. Those weren't incidental questions. They weren't decorative. They were used to track disparities in healthcare access, housing discrimination, economic outcomes, public safety, and bias-related violence. These removals trace back to an executive order signed on January 20th, 2025, directing federal agencies to cease recognizing transgender, non-binary, and intersex identities in their data systems. In the months since, gender identity questions have been overwhelmingly targeted, and many of these removals occurred administratively, without public notice, without public debate. For researchers, this isn't just bureaucratic reshuffling, it undermines the ability to identify trends, allocate resources, and craft policy solutions. You cannot address disparities you refuse to measure. If communities disappear from federal data, they disappear from federal solutions. And invisibility has always been one of the most effective tools of marginalization. So let's continue in Texas. While in Texas, censorship efforts continue escalating. The Katy Independent School District removed 142 LGBTQ plus themed books from the library and classroom shelves in January alone, according to the reporting from the Houston Chronicle and the Texas Freedom to Read Project. 140 titles in a single month. Book bans aren't just removing a single controversial title, but they're about reshaping the narrative landscape, about determining which stories are considered appropriate, which identities are acceptable, which experiences are allowed to exist in public education. For LGBTQ plus students, representation isn't abstract. It can be life-saving. Seeing yourself reflected in a book can mean the difference between isolation and possibility. When those books vanish, the message is very clear. Our next story is the federal Don't Say Trans bill. On Capitol Hill, House Republicans introduced H.R. 7661 just hours after the orange convicted felon's State of the Union address, in which he falsely claimed schools were secretly transitioning students without parental knowledge. The proposed legislation would prohibit federally funded K through 12 schools from developing, implementing, or promoting anything that includes sexually oriented material, broadly defined to include gender dysphoria or transgender identity. Critics are calling it Don't Say Trans bill, and in its language is expansive enough to impact far more than classroom lessons. It could extend to school libraries, student support groups, gay-straight alliances, and potentially even force transgender teachers into the closet. When laws are written vaguely, fear becomes the enforcement mechanism. Schools may overcorrect, they may censor preemptively, and they may shut down supportive spaces simply to avoid legal risk. Again, I'm so sorry to bring you this type of horrible news, but I do have some positive news coming up. Next, international developments. This isn't just a U.S. story. In the United Kingdom, independent experts appointed by the United Nations have warned that the UK risks breaching international human rights obligations over its treatment of transgender people. They expressed serious concern over what they described as regressive forms of gender policy and urged the government to ensure trans people's rights are protected in workplaces and public life. Meanwhile, in Senegal, Prime Minister there has announced legislation that would double the maximum penalty for same-sex relations. Current penalties range from 1 to 5 years in prison. The proposed change would increase that to 5 to 10 years, along with significant fines. The bill would criminalize advocacy for LGBTQIA plus rights. Global progress on LGBTQ plus equality has never been linear. Gains can be reversed, protections can be stripped, and violence matters. And let's go to Sydney, Australia, where a teenage attacker charged with a brutal gay bashing of a 20-year-old man has walked free with 9-month probation and no recorded conviction. The victim has spoken publicly about fear, not just for himself, but for other gay men who may encounter the same individuals. When violent hate crimes result in minimal consequences, it sends a signal, and that signal reverberates. Next, resilience and courage. But amid all of this, there are moments of extraordinary courage. In Chicago, a 30-year-old trans man named Leo Cutdiff is being hailed as a hero after diving into Lake Michigan to rescue a baby whose stroller was blown into the freezing water. He held the stroller above the surface while treading water until help arrived. Both he and the child are reported to be in good condition. And then in Puerto Vallarta, actress Niecy Nash-Betts and her wife, Jessica Betts, found themselves near cartel violence during a birthday trip. Safely back home, Nash shared a message of gratitude and resilience, reminding followers of the power of faith, community, and joy, even in frightening moments. Resilience doesn't erase injustice, but it reminds us that community persists. So happy that Niecy and her wife are home safe. So if there's one thread running through all these stories, it's visibility. Visibility in identification documents, visibility in federal data, visibility in books, visibility in classrooms, and visibility in global human rights framework. Erasure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a deleted survey question. Sometimes it's a pulled library book. Sometimes it's a letter in the mail. But resistance isn't always dramatic either. Sometimes it's legal advocacy. Sometimes it's international accountability. and sometimes it's jumping into freezing water to save a life. Thank you for listening today. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay visible. I will see you tomorrow with more LGBTQ+